Welcome everyone to another episode of Mushroom Revival Podcast. We are unbelievably obsessed with the healing power of mushrooms. We bring on experts and guests from all around the world to geek out with us about the amazing world of mushrooms. And we are bridging the gap between you, our lovely listeners and viewers, and the incredible world of mushrooms. So we are mushrooming the culture around mushrooms. We are so excited to have you as part of the mushroom family. So let's dive in.
Today we have a special guest, Adam Strauss, who is a writer, performer, and comedian from New York. And Adam is known for the comical monologue, The Mushroom Cure, which was a delightful monologue to watch. Adam has also been on a number of other podcasts and videos that have brought a lot of value to people's lives, where he talks about using psilocybin or psychedelics to help with his OCD. And we are so blessed to have him come on the Mushroom Revival podcast and share some of those stories.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Lyra and Alex. Looking forward to talking with you. I am doing, that's always, I do the Mushroom Cure, which is more of a theatrical monologue, but I also, as Lyra mentioned, I do stand-up. Well, I did do stand-up. Obviously, there have been no shows since mid-March, unless if you travel to places. Actually, Texas, you guys are having some shows. I know some comics who are performing there, but that is an exception. So I wouldn't say unfortunately by choice, but also largely necessity. I have not been performing. I have not been to Texas during the pandemic. Florida, I know shows are also happening. But anyway, this is all to say, usually with stand-up, one of the jokes I often open with is this thing, people ask, how are you? And it's just such a fraught question. There's so many infinite dimensions you can answer that, lenses you can view that question by. And I think particularly now, given just the completely destabilizing, wrenching shifts of the last, what are we at? We're at 9 months into this whole pandemic. It's even harder to answer that question. But with those caveats, I would say, yeah, I'm doing well. I mean, I'm very lucky in so many ways compared to so many people right now. And it has been challenging, having my livelihood and a lot of my passion cut off, but it's also enabled me to have the space and time to explore other avenues of creative expression. So that's been exciting. So that is an example of a sort of an authentic answer. And you can see how that takes like 3 minutes as opposed to when people usually ask how you are and they want like 4 words. So that's what my stand-up bit is predicated on.
Oh, we have
I know you guys
together.
are right,
so
right. We
I want to hear your
really
whole life story.
it.
That's why you're here, and that's one of the things I appreciated. We watched an older version of the Mushroom Cure. I haven't seen it in person yet. I hope to see it one day when you come back to Austin. But the authenticity that you bring to your performance is something that was really humbling as a viewer and as a participant of this experience that you create, was just getting really real and really human in all the complexities and downfalls and beautifulness of the human experience. I think you do a really good job of keeping it raw and keeping it real. And so thanks.
Thank you. No, that's high praise. And that is, I would say, one of the things I value most about performance is, I feel like if I'm up there and I'm trying to, of course, there are times where you will play a character intentionally, but I feel like so much of stand-up especially, but a lot of live performance is people kind of presenting a version of themselves that they think the audience wants to see. And some people do that very well, and it's not a knock on them, but that's never interested me. For me, because what I like to see as an audience member is, there are so many stand-ups who are very proficient stand-ups who just bore the fuck out of me, because I'm like, and I'll like someone like John Mulaney, who's a master, but I've seen him live. I mean, he used to be he still is in New York, and I've seen his specials, and I still have no idea who the fuck that guy is. Like, I want to know who someone is when I watch them. And so, yeah, I appreciate you saying that, Alex, because that is what I'm trying to put across, is really myself with all my flaws, all of my limitations, and whatever I have to offer.
It's
Yeah.
something that we're learning, you know, of, presenting this thing that we think people will like. We want to share the information. We want people to like it. And then, we have to be real and be actual real people, behind the,
Right.
behind the screen, behind the mic. And that can be hard to find that balance of, how can we maximize the amount of people that we can spread this cool information, or an interesting experience, or a funny time, or how can we make as many people's lives better and also stay true to our authenticity. And I think what I saw from you, I can't wait to get to know you better in the next hour, but I think you kept it real more than most people that I've ever seen stand up in front of a mic or a camera. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah. And what you alluded to with the question of how are you, and how that's such a formality in discourse today. It doesn't even necessarily mean anything anymore. But that authenticity was very much potent in your presentation. And it's something that I feel that a lot of humans need to learn how to do. It's hard for me to be a full human. It's something that I have to actively think about in front of the camera. And when I'm teaching or doing a podcast or something, how is this disposition for you? Does it come naturally, or did you have to kind of train yourself to be as no filter as possible?
Yeah, I would say to some extent, I've always had a desire to share my experience, which I think is universal. I think we all want to share, and we all want to be seen authentically, but for whatever reason, that's felt like more of a deep need for me than maybe it does for some people. And so when I started doing stand-up, it was a bit of a double-edged sword, because with stand-up, you have a very specific job to do. You have to make people laugh. And that often is at odds with really kind of being present and authentic. And I love stand-up. I do love it. But at times it can feel like a very constricting form. And I mean, I think the best people are able to balance those two requirements really beautifully, like someone like Dave Chappelle, where he really is being himself, but he's also really funny. But the other great thing about Dave Chappelle is he's very comfortable not getting laughter. I mean, if you look at some of his recent specials, the amount of laughs he gets per minute, if you were a beginning comic in New York City, no one would book you. He's earned that, obviously. And also, I think it's also a function of the fact that people just want to see him because he's a celebrity. But a lot of it comes down to, I think, just sheer talent, that he's able to command people's attention and really rivet them even when he's not getting laughs. And in fact, his recent specials, my favorite parts are when he's not getting laughs and he's just going on, and it's kind of getting more and more uncomfortable, with the audience is with him. And that is incredibly rare to be able to do that. So that's all to say, in response to your question, I've always had this need to do that, but it's taken, I think it's been a journey in terms of giving myself permission to just kind of be up there without necessarily getting laughs and stand up, or without trying to play to a certain desired outcome with the audience. And then I think part of it also is, with that show that you saw a tape of the mushroom cure, because it's such a personal story. I can't really, to communicate that story, I kind of have to be really open and really vulnerable. Like, I'm not trying to, present myself in any sort of manicured light there. If I were, it just would defeat the purpose. And again, that's not to knock art. I love sometimes really stylized performances, people who do characters really well. So that's just a different form that for me personally has never held a lot of interest.
So we've had the pleasure of just seeing that video that you sent us of an older, version of the mushroom cure. But for anyone who listening or viewing this right now, maybe not seen it, can you give a quick synopsis of, in the best way possible, of, well,
Yeah.
what exactly is the mushroom cure?
Yeah. So it's a monologue, a theater piece, but it's just a completely true story. And my story, for those who aren't familiar, is I had a very severe obsessive compulsive disorder for many, many years that just didn't respond to any conventional treatment, didn't respond to medication or therapy. And I then stumbled across a study, to date, still the only study of any psychedelic for OCD, which in and of itself is just kind of ridiculous given well, I won't get ahead of myself, but the only study to date, very small pilot study that showed pretty remarkable results. And so after reading this study, I had very little experience with psychedelics at that point in my life, but I figured, what do I have to lose? So I tried to cure my OCD with psychedelics, and the mushroom cure is that story.
One thing I thought was interesting was that you have a BA in psychology. And I don't know at what point in your life the OCD really started pronouncing itself, but
Mhm.
do you believe that this awareness of psychology and just ability to reflect and see cause and effect in your own behavior had any benefit or harm to your states of OCD?
I think it's a double-edged sword. And so I'd say the fact that I had studied psychology formally, though, again, just at an undergraduate level, though I did also come fairly close to enrolling in a PhD program in clinical psychiatry. I applied, I was accepted. I said I was going to go, and then I wound up backing out. But that's just to say I don't have a lot of formal training in any advanced, psychology degree. I don't think it's so much that, but I do think people with OCD tend to be highly analytical. And inevitably, everyone I know with OCD, they apply that analytical sort of framework to their own OCD. Put in simpler terms, I think most people with OCD really try to analyze and understand and figure out their OCD, which can be the reason I said a double-edged sword. It can be helpful to a point, having insight. But I also think with real OCD, by real, I mean severe OCD, I think insight only takes you so far. I think for if figuring out how your OCD worked was enough to give relief, then you wouldn't have OCD. And I think for some people who maybe have more mild forms, that is enough. They can kind of understand it, and then they're like, oh, okay, well, it's just I get caught in this certain thing, and if I just don't do that, then I'll be okay. But for people who really get trapped in severe OCD, there can be this illusion that if I understand the OCD well enough, I'll get freedom. But that is an illusion in my experience for myself and for other people I know with OCD. The real way to freedom with OCD is more surrender, acceptance. And that's where psychedelics can be very helpful. So yeah, I think insight can only take you so far when because, with all sort of mental health issues, the mind that is trying to understand things is the mind that also has this dysfunction, this bug in the system, if you will. So it can't quite fix itself.
And I would love to talk about how psychedelics have helped you, but before we get there, I would love to visit OCD and help our listeners kind of understand what this feels like. Your monologue was extremely helpful for people like us who don't have OCD, or at least not a palpable version enough to be diagnosed, but I loved the scene of you acting out crossing the streets. One side
Ah,
had the sun shining and one side had the trees, and you were like, oh, maybe I have OCD because I don't have enough vitamin D, but I need nature. And
right.
just this incessant crossing of the streets. And, I saw a lot of indecisiveness that came with your OCD. And I saw a lot of, you didn't have so much of the OCD of double checking things. At least you
Mhm.
didn't express that in your mushroom cure, but what are some of the nuances and specificities within your condition just to help people sympathize or empathize with you?
Yeah, I think all OCD, I view OCD really as above all an addiction and I would define an addiction broadly speaking as a behavior that is engaged in to avoid pain, but that behavior itself actually creates more pain, which in turn drives more of the addictive behaviors, the classic vicious cycle. The worse you feel, the more you do OCD. The more you do OCD, the worse you feel. But the caveat there is, like all addictions, there is a little bit of very short-term payoff some of the time. So someone who you mentioned, like people who check, let's say someone who checks the stove because they're worried they left the stove on and they're worried that they're going to burn down their house and murder all their neighbors. It's because there's often that sort of catastrophic magnification of fear that happens with OCD. So when that person checks the stove again, they'll often feel a little bit of relief, very subtle, and maybe it only lasts 5 or 10 seconds, but they do get that little hit of relief, but then it wears off. So they check again to try to get more relief. And the problem is that, first of all, the relief doesn't last. But second of all, the more you engage, the more this person, to use this example, checks the stove, their anxiety actually starts to escalate, because in addition to the anxiety of, oh, maybe I left the stove on, there's now the anxiety of, oh, shoot, I'm an hour late to work, I might get fired. Oh no, my relationship, my marriage is falling apart because I spend 5 hours a day in front of the stove, checking the stove. And all of those things, those real world consequences of OCD in turn drive more anxiety. And people with OCD, OCD is kind of our bottle. It's our drug of choice. So when you're in pain, when you're anxious, someone who has OCD, they're going to engage in OCD behavior to try to feel better, even if the source of their anxiety or pain is a real world problem. And so that just drives more of this whole vicious cycle. And that's why OCD, it has a pretty poor prognosis in terms of conventional treatment. Medication, about half of people with OCD don't respond to any medication. The half who do typically see only about a 25% symptom reduction. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a little bit better, but even there, if you really parse the data, only about a quarter of people see like really significant relief with therapy. Many people see some relief, but most people, the overall picture is most people with OCD, they continue to suffer. There may be some improvement, but they continue to suffer even if they avail themselves of conventional treatments. And I think that's just because it's real. Once you get trapped in this addictive cycle where the thing that you do to make yourself feel better actually makes you feel worse, it's very hard to escape that. And addictions across the board are notoriously difficult to treat. We think of addictions as substances, and obviously those can be devastating. But I have not struggled with substance use disorders, but I know people who have and also have OCD, and they will generally say, man, quitting heroin was tough, but OCD is a lot tougher because with heroin, I had to call my guy. I had to go to the corner to score it. Or if I'm an alcoholic, I had to go into the bar. But OCD, the drug, it's between my ears. It's in my brain. So that makes it all the more difficult. You can't just separate yourself. An alcoholic can say, I'm just not going to pick up a drink. It's damn hard to do that. I'm not saying that's easy. It may be impossible for many people at many times, but it's theoretically something you can do. But I can't say, well, I'm just not going to make decisions since my OCD focused on decision making. Someone else with contamination fear can't say, well, I'll just never wash my hands. I just won't go into the bathroom. So it's like with OCD, we have to pick up the drug of choice a certain number of times a day and yet somehow not get caught. And that's why I think for most people, it's just really, 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 really hard to find real freedom from OCD. And so for me, as I mentioned, and as you mentioned, it was mostly decision-making, but that in and of itself, I would say is also kind of a form of checking. Someone who's afraid they've left the stove on, they're checking to make sure the stove is off. Someone who has contamination fear, they're checking to make sure they're perfectly clean. For me, it was more this internal checking. Did I make the right decision? Maybe I didn't make the right decision. Maybe I should change my decision. Oh, no, I should walk on the other side of the street so I get enough vitamin D. No, wait, that doesn't feel right. Let me cross back over. So I think checking whether it happens internally in one's mind or externally in the physical reality is a common element of OCD. So that's, a little bit of how I view OCD.
One of the most interesting parts of the show was when you said, for people who feel what I'm feeling, raise your, or have OCD, raise your hands 7 times.
Right,
and
right.
then you say, well, maybe you came in here not thinking you had OCD, but now you're kind of questioning it after really going in through these experiences and showing people what it's like. And I know a couple times during the show, especially when you were actually on mushrooms and going through that inner dialogue of well, I have more and I haven't gotten into it yet, and should I just take it, but my parents are coming,
Right.
and like
Right.
or even just like changing your shirt like 7 times, or just like I was like, interesting, because I've had trips where that was my inner dialogue to a dime,
Yeah.
and it was like, holy shit. And I started to question myself, and I'm sure it's annoying to hear, certain people say like, oh, I'm so OCD about, or you're
Right.
being so OCD about XYZ, or whatever. But it's a spectrum. Is that right? Do you think that everyone has or is on the OCD spectrum? Just some people are further along, or their kind of dial is a little more to the right or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it. I think that's true of all these things. I never know what term to use: mental illness, psychological disorder. These are such arbitrary terms to try to capture, I think, phenomena that everyone has some degree of experiencing. I mean, maybe stuff like schizophrenia. I guess I've never had auditory hallucinations per se, so maybe that is more of a discrete disorder. But even that, I don't know. I guess my overall feeling is certainly. Let me be more succinct answering your question, Alex. Absolutely, something like OCD. I think there is a spectrum, and I think it can be somewhat arbitrary at what point you draw a line and say, oh, this person has OCD, this person doesn't have OCD. And I do meet a lot of people who, after the show, will be like, wow, I didn't really think I had OCD, but what you described, I relate to. And the question I'll always ask them is, I'll say, well, does it cause a lot of distress or dysfunction for you? That, for me, is the best sort of determiner, if that's a word, determinant, I think that's the word, determinant of whether, in my non-professional opinion, or I would say someone does or doesn't have OCD. Because I've met people who have said, yeah, I relate to a lot of what you said, but it doesn't bother me. And I'll be like, good for you. I envy you. Godspeed, and then I'll also meet people who will describe symptoms that on the surface seem pretty minor, like it doesn't happen that often for them, and it doesn't take over for that long, but it causes a great deal of distress. And yeah, I would say then that's a problem that you want to try to find some way to address.
Hey guys.
If you love the show and want to continue getting tantalizing mushroom content such as this, please consider supporting us by going to mushroomrevival.com and purchasing one of our amazing mushroom products.
This is how we keep the lights on. This is a total passion project. We do not offer any outside advertisers, and this has totally revolutionized our health. We want to spread the mushrooms far and wide in every corner possible. If you're listening to this, we will offer you a special coupon code that we're not offering anybody else. If you're listening to this, this is a little Easter egg that you just found. The coupon code is called
Pod Treat, PODTREAT, all caps, no
and
spaces.
To figure out how much you actually save, you got to figure it out. You got to open that Easter egg as well and put it into your cart to find out a special offering that only you will get. We love these products. They help revolutionize our health, and we want to share that health and abundance with you guys who equally love mushrooms as much as we do. So when you go watch a movie, you get a bowl of popcorn, obviously. So when you listen to mushroom podcasts, you get a mushroom tincture pumping through your veins, pumping through your eardrums. You are a mushroom. Help the Mushroom Revival. We love you guys so much. Back to the show. Do you think there isn't much research or kind of psychedelic therapy or just any pharmacological drug out there or treatment because it's not very well understood, because it's somewhat of a spectrum, because the symptoms vary person to person? Do you think it's just a lack of research, of education, or an understanding of what exactly is OCD?
Well, there are a lot of medications for OCD. They're just not that effective. I mean, the general, like sort of the pharmacopoeia for traditional psychiatry is pretty limited. You have SSRIs, Paxil, Prozac, Zoloft, Lexapro, all of those I was on at various times. You have benzos, Ativan, Klonopin, that sort of thing. Then you have antipsychotics. And so this is part of why I don't love this whole idea where we classify discrete mental disorders like you have depression, you have OCD, when in fact the same medications are kind of thrown at all of this stuff. So those medications are generally not that effective for OCD. They're also generally not that effective for depression. The caveat I will throw in is some people they are very effective for, which is an interesting question in and of itself, is why do some people respond well to this stuff when most people don't? But to stay somewhat on topic, so there are plenty. If you go to a psychiatrist and they diagnose you with OCD, they're going to have no shortage of tools in their toolbox that they can throw at the problem. The issue is that most of them are not going to help most people. And I think, but to your question, yeah, I think part of it does come down to, I mean, OCD was not like Freud wrote some about OCD and actually confessed that he and psychoanalysis in general were pretty powerless over OCD. So I think it's probably less well studied and well understood than, say, depression. But there still is a lot of resources going into research, and there's been a ton of money going into drug development. But yeah, we just haven't found really good solutions thus far, other than psychedelics.
Right.
Yeah, you said during your performance, you said you took yoga for 2 years, meditation for 5 years, acupuncture, hypnotherapy, homeopathy. And so you said you just looked on Google OCD cure, and it just auto-filled the rest of that sentence.
Right. I typed in OCD and it auto-filled. I typed in OC and Google auto-filled D-cures, right?
Yeah.
Because I Googled that phrase obsessively.
The study was actually from 2009 by Francisco Moreno and colleagues.
Actually, 2006, believe it or not, December 2006. Yeah, it's an old study. And the reason I want to emphasize that date is because I think it highlights the absurdity of the fact that there has not been follow-up research in now 14 years, though there are 2 studies underway now, thankfully, which we could talk more about. But nothing's been published. 14 years since this one study that showed incredibly promising results for a condition where we have a real paucity of other treatments. And I mean, there should be tens of millions of dollars going into psychedelic research for OCD, but there has been not a single published study, though. Again, that will change in 2021. We'll have 2 studies coming out next year.
Is that, I noticed that the mushroom cure was actually funded by MAPS, and MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Did you reach out to MAPS and say, hey, I found this study, can you help me? Like, how did that go?
Yeah, I reached out to I reached out to MAPS. I'd been doing the show for a few years. So I started doing the show. I had these experiences, now over 10 years ago, 10 years ago. I started doing the show in 2012. And at that point, it was such a different climate. Like, I would tell people the premise of the show. Oh, yeah, it's the true story of how I tried to cure my OCD with mushrooms. And people would just be completely like puzzled. They'd be like, wait, you tried to cure mental illness with psychedelics? Psychedelics cause mental illness. Like, it's like if I was telling someone, oh yeah, I tried to cure my lung cancer by smoking 2 packs a day of Marlboros. It just did not register. But I kept doing the show. And then how did I get connected to MAPS originally? Oh, it's a pretty, well, it depends on whether or not you believe in randomness, but I was doing a stand-up show in LA in 2016. Yeah, 2016. And another comic on the bill happened to be on the board of MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. I didn't do the mushroom cure. I was just doing, normal generic stand-up. I didn't even talk about psychedelics on stage that night, but we became friends. And then he found out I had the show and connected me to the MAPS folks. And they were, super supportive. I mean, they're a great organization that really they've done so much to push this, the science forward and public acceptance forward. So I'm honored to be associated with them.
Yeah, MAPS is wonderful, and we're so grateful that they're growing. One of our friends is potentially going to work for them, just doing some data analysis, and it's refreshing to see them expand and be taken very seriously and help fund this other research, because like you said, with what's going on right now with pharmacopoeia and mental illnesses is not very effective. But when you look at the data with psychedelics, it is overwhelmingly convincing that this is the way to go. What do you know about rewiring or helping mitigate some of the other firings that were causing the OCD? I don't know if you've done any research on this, but I'm interested to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, there is no research on this. So the one study out of Moreno's lab in University of Arizona was just this small pilot study. They didn't do, I don't believe they did any sort of brain imaging or anything like that. However, there is a great, I can't remember his name, Eddie someone out of Imperial College in London, did a really good overview of OCD and psychedelics, where he basically, again, there's not much research, but he outlines a lot of theoretical mechanisms that might explain why not mushrooms specifically, psychedelics in general, but he does talk about psilocybin may be effective for OCD. So my limited understanding, and I guess this also relates to the earlier question about is OCD poorly understood? And maybe I should have been more specific or more emphatic there. Yes, it is, but I think I'll use the term mental illnesses for convenience. I think mental illnesses in general are poorly understood. There's no blood test that can tell you, oh, you have depression, you have schizophrenia. There's no, the pharmaceutical industry has pushed the idea that, oh, you have a chemical imbalance and these SSRIs correct a chemical imbalance, but that's bullshit. I'll cite a data point that always astonishes people, which is why I love citing it. Many people, even, sophisticated medical consumers, have kind of bought into this idea that, well, if you're depressed, you have low serotonin. If you're schizophrenic, you have high dopamine. Bullshit. There's never been any correlation established between any neurotransmitter state and any sort of mental illness. So there are very depressed people who have high serotonin. There are extremely happy people who have low serotonin. Now, there is a connection. If you elevate people's serotonin who are depressed, they will often find some at least short-term release. But the idea that there's a specific chemical or structural cause for these conditions, we can't say that there's not, but we certainly have not found that. There's no clear establishment of that. So that's all to say that those are great questions, Lyra, and not only do I not know the answers, even someone working on, I mean, there are people who know a lot more about this than I do, clearly, but certainly with OCD, what we do know is glutamate seems to be implicated in it, which implies that ketamine may have some efficacy. And what's her name? Caroline Rodriguez out of Stanford has done some intriguing work on this. I've had the honor of having her do talkbacks after the mushroom cure, but it's all preliminary. So we don't, there's various mechanisms hypothesized, but ultimately no one can say, oh, you have OCD because of this chemical difference in your brain or anatomical difference. But again, I don't want to say, clearly there is stuff going on structurally and neurologically. We just can't pinpoint exactly what that is. We know there are these different systems that are implicated, but we don't quite know how. So what I can speak to with psychedelics in my own experience is more what happens subjectively, where if we go back to this idea of an addiction, you're trying to, you engage in an OCD behavior because you want to feel better, and it may make you feel better for a few seconds, a few minutes, but then it makes you feel worse, so you repeat it. Where psychedelics have been helpful for me is, well, so if you're instead of trying to get rid of that discomfort, that anxiety by engaging in the behavior, the checking, the reversing decisions, if instead of trying to get rid of it, you're willing to sit with it, to feel that anxiety, then that sort of undercuts the incentive to engage in OCD in the first place. So that's where psychedelics have been helpful in a few ways, but I'd say the main one has been in enabling me to just sit with the anxiety and discomfort, to have these unwanted obsessive thoughts and to have this intense fear in my body. And instead of trying to get rid of it with obsessive thinking and compulsive rituals, to just let it be there. And when you do that, it tends to dissipate on its own, but not immediately.
Could you describe what it was like when you were first confronting your OCD with the help of the mushrooms or other plant medicines?
Yeah. I did not go about this, as you both know from seeing that tape of the show. I didn't do this this would be a classic, don't try this at home, because I was doing, large doses of different psychedelics in pretty quick succession without a lot of time for integration. I didn't really have any support. So predictably, it was a bit haphazard, and the results were sometimes not what I expected. I had some experiences that were actually, in the short term, somewhat traumatizing. And I had one experience. I don't think this was in the version of the show that you two saw, but it was in earlier versions when the show was longer. I had one particularly traumatic experience that really made the OCD worse for several months. So for me, it was sort of a case of psychedelics helping almost in spite of me being a little bit of an idiot in the way I was going about it. But I'd say, yeah, over multiple trips, I gradually had the experience more and more. Well, first of all, I think a big part of it was just connecting me to my physical experience, to my body, because OCD is such a mind disorder. It's all about thinking. I look at it as, you can't have OCD without thoughts. If there weren't thoughts, oh my God, I left the stove on. Oh no, I'm contaminated. Oh no, maybe I hit someone with my car. If you don't have those thoughts, you don't have OCD. However, the roots of those thoughts are in the body. There's always a physical sensation that we don't want to have. And the thoughts, which are essentially obsessions, are, I believe, a response to that sensation and an attempt to neutralize it. So it's like, all right, I'm afraid I left the stove on. Well, if I think about it really hard, maybe I'll convince myself I turned it off and I'll feel relief. Or if I check it for the 57th time, I'll reassure myself the stove is off and I'll feel relief. But that reassurance is going to happen in my brain. It's a thought, basically, like, okay, the stove is off. So a big part of psychedelics for me have been just facilitating more physical awareness, what's actually happening in my body, because that's where fear and anxiety exists. Fear is not a thought. You might have thoughts that can exacerbate fear. You might have thoughts in response to fear, but fear, we use the term emotion, but really it's just a physical sensation. It's a constellation of sensation in our body that we term anger or sadness or fear. And to get freedom from OCD, and I think most conditions, a real key is just being able to really fully experience those sensations. But I was so up in my head with the OCD, I just wasn't aware of what was happening physically. It was driving my behavior, but I had no sort of access to it. And psychedelics, both plant-based psychedelics as well as synthetic psychedelics like LSD, were really critical in enabling me to just feel the sensations in my body. And once I could feel them, then I had the choice to sit with them versus trying to get rid of them with obsessive behavior and thinking.
You brought up your kind of back of the napkin diagnosis for OCD,
Yeah.
which is, how much distress is this giving someone? And usually when people have addiction or similar distressing experiences in their life, they have to hit rock bottom before they're like, okay, I need to find help and find something different, because obviously everything that I'm trying isn't working. did you have a darkest night or like a moment where you hit sort of rock bottom, which led you to Google search, OCD cures and how do I get to the bottom of this?
Yeah, I think in the show that you saw, I would say you just nailed it, Alex. That kind of was that. Unfortunately, I'd say there wasn't just one rock bottom. There were multiple rock bottoms, but that certainly was a rock bottom where the show itself opens up with me just caught in the throes of an OCD crisis. I'm trying to make a relatively trivial decision, and it's taken over my life for days. And so certainly that was a rock bottom where it was just like, I can't live like this anymore, but I've tried all the medication. I've seen all the specialists. I've tried all the alternative and complementary treatments. Nothing's worked. And then I found this study.
What, in your experience from, I think you tried San Pedro or
I did.
peyote?
Well, actually, I did try San Pedro, and I also tried. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing this right. Bergicii, which is another mescaline containing cacti. And then I also tried Peruvian torch. Never had the opportunity to try actual peyote.
Cool. And I think you brought up LSD, and I think there were some derivatives of LSD that you're talking about in the show, but you obviously call the show The Mushroom Cure. And do you find that mushrooms were the most beneficial in kind of rewriting your neural pathways, to kind of showing you the mirror of the addictive qualities that are obviously causing distress? Do you think that was the impactful?
Yeah. It's hard for me to say because I wasn't running a good controlled experiment, because I was doing, I would do San Pedro, and then a week later I would do 2CE, and then 2 weeks later I'd do LSD. And then, so it's hard to say. What I will say is, so I had this period that I recount in The Mushroom Cure where I was doing a lot of psychedelics. I ultimately did get a substantial degree of relief due to psychedelics and other things. And then I sort of backed off psychedelics for a while. And I would say, but now, in recent years, I do continue to work with them. I think where mushrooms might be, I guess what I would say is, it feels to me like mushrooms and probably ayahuasca have perhaps been a little bit more helpful than things like LSD, because there's more of a physical component to them. There's more of like a body feeling with them. So like with ayahuasca, at least for me, I can't not be aware of my body. It just pulls me into my body, for better or for worse. Whatever is going on, whatever sensations are there, I'm going to feel. And mushrooms can do that too, particularly at higher doses. Whereas LSD for me can be more of a heady experience, which isn't to say it can't be helpful. So I can't really draw any firm conclusions. And I do think that LSD can also, and for me probably has had some benefits for OCD, but I would say, I think the research, so the one study that's been published was of psilocybin, and the two studies that are now underway, one out of Arizona and one out of Yale, are also psilocybin. And I think that's a smart move. I think if we're going to start with one compound, I think that's a good candidate, because it does have a strong body component. And also I'd say this, surrender is such a big part of psychedelic healing with OCD, just letting go. And mushrooms and ayahuasca, they can be more difficult to negotiate with, say, than something like LSD. I've been on high doses of LSD and voluntarily walked up to police officers to ask them directions, because I feel like, oh, I'm in control of this experience. Like I'm not whereas mushrooms, they're for me, there's often been a sense of, oh yeah, I kind of have to submit to what's happening. And I think that it's funny because people with OCD, we don't like to let go of control. We want to rigidly control everything, but the healing comes in letting go. And I think mushrooms may be a little bit better for that than, say, something like LSD or even cactus.
Yeah. And one of the things you said was your kind of pill bottle was in between your ears.
Right. With OCD. Yeah.
Yeah. And I found just with the same thing with mushrooms and ayahuasca. Is super body oriented, and the mind can just whip up so much dis-ease, and just make up all these stories and all these just mind loops, and you can get lost. And one of the practices that I've learned of, if you're in one of those mind loops, a quote unquote bad trip, and you just can't get out of your head, is to jump in a freezing cold shower. Mm-hmm. And it just kind of jolts you back in your body, and you're like, I gotta get back in my body and warm up. And it just jumps you out of your head. And I think that's really important. We had someone come on talk about the importance of meditation along with psilocybin. And a lot of these practices of, yoga is yoking the mind, body, spirit of these somatic experiences interwoven with psychedelics, and going beyond the old ideology that the mind is just in your brain. And we're not just floating heads. We have a body for a reason. And there's so much intelligence to the body. 90% of our serotonin is produced in our gut. 70% of our immune system's in our gut. And we're learning that so much trauma is stored in our body for up to 9 generations. I mean, I think we're getting to the breakthrough of wellness and mental health, and a lot of what we previously didn't understand, which we previously thought was some chemical imbalance in the brain, which sometimes it is, but there are so many other dimensions to health and healing that I think we're just on the brink of, which is super exciting that it's now, again, like you just said, it's being recognized, it's being thought of as legit science. It's not this woo-woo, like you're explaining. It's like, why are you taking psychedelics to cure OCD? Like, what is that? I'm excited. I'm excited to bridge all these modalities and bridge this interconnected view of the universe, that it's not as straightforward as we thought. And if we could piece all the pieces together, we can really make sense of the world around us.
Yeah, I think that's been a big limitation of traditional psychotherapy, is it's kind of like a brain talking to another brain. You're sitting there and you're talking, you're using your mind, and someone else is using their mind to try to, quote unquote, solve a problem. And I think that's one of the most powerful things about the psychedelic paradigm, is that it's putting us into just a fundamentally different relationship to whatever, again, I keep using the term mental illness. I can't think of a better one, but whatever disorder or illness, which is that this is not, like you said, we're not just floating heads walking around. We have a body, and that's a huge part of our experience that traditional therapy just doesn't deal with, it just doesn't deal with it.
And some yogis might think I'm wrong. And, there's a lot of philosophies there. You're not the body. Yeah. But, and then some, philosophies are, you can reach enlightenment through the body, a lot of tantric practices or a lot of fields of yoga. It's, this is the universe, and we are consciousness, being conscious of consciousness itself. Part of it is this plane, and let's be aware of everything. And I think, in my experience, it's when we get stuck in just a limited aspect of reality is when a lot of illness comes about, in my experience, and a lot of dis-ease. We're not at ease because we're not at one with the universe, with all of ourself, with everything that exists. And if we're just stuck in the head, we can't be at ease, you know. We're limiting ourselves and our human experience or our divine experience if we're just if we're stuck. Energy can't flow. So I'm excited that those philosophies and modalities are, some people might say they're legitimized if they're talked about through a PhD and a lab coat, but and similar to what we were talking about before of, you know, what is the balance between being authentic and being able to spread a mission or education to the masses. Is there might be some times that you have to shapeshift and speak a language that really translates to the most amount of people. And I think it's, some people are like, oh, wow, you know, we already knew this information and we don't need a PhD to tell people. But for Joe Schmo out there who doesn't, you know, thinks all mushrooms are wacky hippie stuff or, you know, things like that, I think it's super important to have those scientific research papers. And I'm excited for that, for people who only need a PhD or a doctor to tell them this is legit. I'm excited for doctors to be able to have research to talk to Joe Schmo and Stacy or Karen or whoever right. that will not take it seriously. And so I think this is a new paradigm that I'm excited for.
Yeah, no, it's, you know, and I certainly don't consider myself an educator or an expert. I've just had my own experience that I share with people, and what they take from that, I can't control. Obviously, I do have my own beliefs, and I do think that, yeah, you just look at the efficacy of psychedelics, what we're seeing for, again, OCD, it's just one study. Depression, there's now a growing body of research. PTSD is probably the most well-studied condition, MDMA for PTSD, thanks to MAPS. And the effect sizes, the benefits are orders of magnitude beyond what you're seeing with any other therapy. So, you know, as you said, Alex, it just makes, for some people, that's what they need to believe in this stuff. And, you know, I would say I'm one of those people too. I don't think I would have tried, I know I wouldn't have tried psychedelics for my OCD had I not found this study. I love science. I think it's an incredibly useful tool for grappling with reality. I think there are limits to it, of course. But I think it's very powerful. So I'm excited, and I think it can help. I think we can figure out, you know, best practices for psychedelics. We can, I don't see there being any reason for traditional approaches to using psychedelic shamanism, ceremonies, that sort of thing, to be at odds with the scientific approach, as long as science stays humble and acknowledges the fact of, you know, there's a huge element of subjective experience always in grappling with reality, and I think especially with psychedelics. So, I think, you know, we need, especially when we're dealing with problems like OCD, which are just so debilitating, or depression or substance abuse. I want science partnering with psychedelics. I want us to use whatever we can to try to help people.
If I had OCD and I was listening to this and hoping to get a kernel of advice for how to use psychedelics, what would you say? I mean, you talk about a multitude of experiences with psychedelics, a multitude of substances, times, places, sometimes traumatic, sometimes healing. If within retrospect, what sort of delivery would you offer somebody who's hoping to use mushrooms for OCD?
Yeah, it's a tough question for a few reasons. One is because psychedelics, one of the things about, I sometimes take issue with like psychedelic exceptionalism, the idea that, oh, these things are so different from every other drug or compound, but they kind of are in some ways. And one of the ways they're different are, you know, if you use alcohol or cocaine or aspirin or caffeine, you're going to get a pretty reproducible, like the same effect more or less every time. And psychedelics, as we all know, you can take the same dose of the same substance in the same setting and have a very, very different experience. So that's all to say it's hard to generalize, not just between from me to someone else, but even for an individual. Like you can't, it's hard to have these totally reproducible experiences. The other reason it's tough to give specific advice is we just don't have a lot of research, for OCD. Having said that, I can speak from my own personal experience. So I personally have found higher doses more helpful. People ask me a lot about microdosing. I know a lot of people find microdosing very helpful. My limited experiments with microdosing, I didn't particularly care for it. Particularly to deal with OCD, as we were discussing earlier, that experience of surrender seems to be, for me, it may be different for other people, but for me, that seems to be a key ingredient to the healing, that just sort of letting go. And paradoxically, it's sometimes easier to let go with a higher dose. When it's kind of more of a moderate dose, I can kind of negotiate with it or try to hold on. But with a really strong dose, it's like, well, shit, there's no way I can hold on. So let me just let go and trust that things will be okay, even if I'm absolutely terrified right now. So I think, and that's I know someone who's involved with the Yale studies, and they're working with pretty high doses there, and actually Arizona too, for these new OCD studies. So, so personal experience, I've generally found higher doses to be more helpful, but I've also found lower doses to be helpful at times, not like microdoses, but sometimes like 2 grams, 2.5 grams. But beyond that, I would just encourage anyone who wants to work with this stuff for OCD, since there's not a lot of specific data about OCD, my encouragement would be to familiarize yourself with general best practices for psychedelics. So, set and setting, for probably most of your listeners are familiar given the title of your podcast, but your mindset and your physical setting. However, I often get people asking me like, well, should I wait until I feel like, I'm not having much OCD, I'm in a stable place before I use psychedelics? Yeah, ideally, but if you're someone who's really struggling with OCD day in and day out, if you're going to wait until you're in the quote unquote right mindset, you may never find the right time. So I think you don't want to be too rigid about that, but you certainly wouldn't want to have an intense psychedelic trip immediately after getting some sort of, say, particularly distressing news, the death of a loved one, the end of a relationship, obvious stuff like that. Anyway, I'm not going to go through all of the guidelines, but I guess what I would say is there's a lot of resources out there online. You can also read some of the studies. Again, there aren't really OCD studies, but you can read the sort of protocols they're following for depression out of Imperial College, some of the MAP studies of MDMA for PTSD, just to get a sense of what sort of setting you want to try to achieve. It can be useful to have a guide, though my most useful experiences personally were actually solo journeys. So it's hard to generalize, but I would say you want to approach this stuff with humility, with openness, with respect, and with, clarity as to what your intent is. What are you looking to get from psychedelics? Initially I was looking at it as kind of this fix that if I take the right dose and the right setting, I'll have this perfect experience and I'll be cured forever. And as you both know from seeing the show, that's not the way it panned out. So I think having a clear sense of, well, what am I looking for here? I'm looking for healing, but what does that look like for me? And I think for people with OCD, what that often looks like is a greater willingness and ability to really sit with your feelings.
Thanks for that. And how is your OCD today? And do you continue to use psychedelics to maintain homeostasis?
Today, my OCD is very good. Yesterday, it was also very good. Tomorrow, it might not be as good. There are good days and bad days, but what I'd say is there are many more good days than bad days now. There's a huge difference where I'm at now than where I was at before I began working with psychedelics. Not all of that was due to psychedelics. As you saw in the show, there were other things as well that I found helpful that sort of came into my life. But I look at psychedelics as necessary for the healing I've had, but not sufficient in and of themselves. I think if I had just done psychedelics without any of the other stuff, I found an OCD support group that was very helpful, spiritual practices, meditation, very helpful. I think if I had just done psychedelics without any of that stuff, I wouldn't have had the same degree of healing. But I also look at it like that stuff without psychedelics wouldn't have been that effective. Sometimes I think of psychedelics almost as a catalyst, isn't quite the word I'm looking for, sort of like a facilitator. There's got to be a better word for this, or a better metaphor. I'd have to think about it. But essentially, well, you talked about meditation earlier, and I meditated for years, but it was only after I started working with psychedelics that meditation finally clicked for me. I had one experience on a fairly low dose of a synthetic tryptamine, 4-ACO-DMT, where I was meditating, and it was like, oh, this is what every book I've read about meditation is talking about. Just this state of isness. Oh, this is the thing I've been going for. And after that one experience, which now is 10 years ago, my relationship to meditation is fundamentally different, and meditation is a very useful practice for me. And I found that to be true of a lot of different things. So that, yeah, psychedelics kind of, and maybe just thinking out loud, maybe part of that is a lot of these practices are not really mind practices. So before psychedelics, I was trying to comprehend meditation with my brain. I was trying to comprehend prayer with my brain. And after psychedelics, I was more able to engage with those practices at more of a kind of rooted physical level, where those practices can really bear fruit. So the OCD, to answer your question, Lyra, it is a lot better, but I would still identify as having OCD, by which I mean there are times when I get trapped in that same cycle of trying to figure things out, trying to get things right. I get trapped in an OCD cycle. When it happens now, though, it happens less frequently. And when it does happen, it doesn't last as long. I'm basically, what happens is I reach a point, usually sooner rather than later, where it's like, okay, I'm getting trapped now. I'm going to have to put down the bottle at some point, which for me with OCD means I'm going to have to just surrender to the fact that I'm going to be really fucking uncomfortable for at least a little bit of time, rather than using my brain, my mind, to try to figure out how to make everything perfect. And I usually reach that point, pretty quickly. And then I may suffer for a while longer as I just kind of feel the things I don't want to feel, and then it passes. So it's it's a life-changing difference for sure.
If you had an unlimited budget and a kick-ass research team, what do you think, what research would you like to see done? And then beyond that, kind of what resources do you wish to develop here in the States and across the world for OCD?
Yeah, I mean, the research, so top of the list would just be more psychedelic research for OCD. I mean, 2 million people in this country, actually, no, it's about 2% of the population. So you're looking in the US, somewhere around 7 million people have OCD. 10% of people with OCD ultimately commit suicide. I mean, this is a massive public health problem that we just don't have good answers for. So to me, putting $100 million into this problem, I'm sure it would pay for itself within, the first year in terms of lives saved. So that would be top of the list for me. But yeah, then I'd love to see research of psychedelics in conjunction with other practices. We're seeing some research now. There was some out of Hopkins with psychedelics and meditation specifically. I'm really curious to see research on psychedelics in prayer. Prayer can be a very powerful practice for surrender, whether or not you believe in any sort of higher power. Just the act of praying, for me, one, it clarifies for me what I truly want. What are my priorities? And two, it clarifies for me what I can't hope to achieve on my own and what I have to just kind of surrender and trust around. So I think that can be very powerful when combined with psychedelics. So seeing I'd love to see studies on dance and psychedelics. I think that could be super, super healing. So psychedelics with sort of non-mind practices. I'm very curious to see what happens there. And in terms of resources, I mean, do you mean in terms of for people with OCD or other conditions, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the sort of the obvious top of the list thing would be clinics where people could avail themselves of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And the good news is we are going to see that soon. I mean, MDMA for PTSD has now been fast tracked under this sort of expanded access where the FDA allows people to use things before they've been fully approved in cases where there aren't other good treatments, which there certainly isn't for a lot of people with PTSD. You're going to start to see in 2021 legal use of MDMA in a clinical setting. So that's super exciting. Psilocybin will be next, initially approved for depression, but once this stuff is approved, it can be used for other conditions. So we are going to see that soon. But yeah, I would like to see, I think for OCD, it would be really helpful to see a very sort of comprehensive treatment program that involves group support. I think group support is very helpful with addictions like OCD. Involves use of psilocybin and potentially other psychedelics, but also involves just a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy, a real comprehensive program where you're just kind of throwing everything you can at this problem to help people get some freedom. And I am hopeful that we'll start to see stuff like that relatively soon.
It's funny you brought up prayer and psychedelics because I was doing research on the oldest woman ever to live. I believe her name is Jean Calment. She's a French woman, and she was almost 123 years old. And
wow,
the craziest thing was that not only did her health only start to decline when she moved into an elderly home, but other things is that she spent over an hour a day in prayer. And just saying how grateful she was of different things in her life and counting her blessings. But she smoked 2 cigarettes a day and drank I think glasses of wine and ate over 3 pounds of chocolate a week, which I thought was really funny. And and always opted for desserts. Like every meal she ate a dessert and routinely practiced anaerobics. So just moving her body. And a lot of people in the elderly home said that she was the most mobile out of anyone there. And she was the oldest person in the world. And even people 30, 40 years younger than her, she was actually more mobile because she made sure, she was in a wheelchair at the end of her life, but she made sure to move all of her joints and have these kind of bodily somatic practices. So I thought that was funny. These similarities to longevity are also, I think, really important synergies with psychedelics as well.
Yeah. I had actually, was it during a trip? I don't remember, but I think it was where I realized, oh, wow, I sometimes go a week without literally lifting my hands above my head. That's crazy. This is such a basic physical capability that all humans, or, if you're not disabled, have, that I just don't exercise regularly. And yeah, I make it a regular practice. I mean, I love dancing. There's obviously no dance parties now, but so I'll just kind of freak out on my own, at least once or twice a week, just put my body through its range of motion.
Yeah. One of my favorite practices is starting from your toes and trying to move every single extremity or every single joint that you can. And so try to move each toe, although it's hard. And then you go to your ankles and your knees and your hips and your spine and your shoulders and your elbows and each finger. And then you go to your face or you go to your neck, and then you try to move your tongue around, try to move your lips and if you can flare your nostrils, and then go to your eyes and just do eye movement. You look ridiculous. You look absolutely ridiculous, but I can actually move my ears and just try to move as many things as possible. And afterwards you're like, holy shit, I'm in a body. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
It's
you can do so
whoa.
much.
Yeah. And so she would actually do those practices as well.
Wow.
So if anyone's trying to be, what is it called? A super centennial, I think is what they call.
Oh, wow.
I haven't heard that phrase. That's
Yeah,
great.
yeah. So prayer, if you smoke, apparently, you didn't help. And then chocolate, wine, and moving your body,
Somatics.
move your booty.
Yeah.
And lots of laughter. Do you think laughter is one of the best medicines?
I think laughter is profound. I think, I do. Because I think, to me, laughter is another form of surrender. It's a letting go. It's such a weird thing. Like laughter and crying we don't know, I have not heard a compelling explanation physiologically or psychologically or sociologically as to why we do these things. The best I've heard for laughter is it's this sort of group bonding thing that, oh, you're laughing, I'm laughing, we're sharing an experience, which, maybe there's something to that. But I mean, it's a universal thing that every human, and there's some evidence animals also engage in it. It's got to have some high evolutionary value. I believe, I believe in things beyond science, but I also believe in science, and I do believe in evolution. So to have this trait that's conserved across all humans, it must be absolutely essential. And I think part of it may be it's this practice of, it's a letting go. We take ourselves so seriously, we hold on so tightly, even physically. And what happens when you laugh is it's just this physical, emotional, this complete, release at every level. And so, I think that's very healing. And I think it's one of the things I love about comedy is I look at laughter as it's valuable in and of itself, but it can also be a means to an end, because when someone is laughing, they're open. And I feel like that's when you can kind of, cram some truth down their throat, whatever you consider truth to be. You can reach people in a way that it's disarming. It's disarming. And I think that can be very, very helpful in getting people to open up to new ideas and new experiences.
We actually just had a guest on, Larry Evans, who's doing some psilocybin work in Jamaica. And he found, I think it was over 2 grams was where it's a threshold where he found anyone, who is taking mushrooms over 2 grams, I think it was, that he found that was the dose to get your laugh back.
That's great.
And he noticed that everyone over that dose just had this just super surrendered belly laugh, just like this uproar, this just, and everything is so funny, and it's just so, everything is good, and you're just laughing at the universe. We've been actually watching a ton of stand-up recently in this weird COVID time, and it's just such a good practice for even a couple hours a day. We're just laugh and, not take life too seriously. And we get wrapped up in these stories and these identities and these costumes and all these things we trap ourselves in, and to have someone not only point them out, but to reach those deep truths in your life and tell these stories that you're like, oh my God, that is so me. And to laugh at it is so humbling. And I think it's so good for the human spirit.
And profoundly relatable. And is this not the last stage of the Turing test? If you can make a robot laugh, then they have achieved consciousness comparable to us. I'm not sure if it is, but I definitely know that humor is a very difficult thing to teach a computer. And it's hard to really describe what is funny and then put that into code. So I've read.
I believe that.
I mean, people say humor is the highest form of wisdom.
So we have one final question, and we ask all of our guests on our show this, and usually we give them a warning of what this question is. You opted out of that warning. You said keep it spontaneous.
Let's see.
Yeah, we'll keep it a surprise.
It would be hilarious right now if you confronted me from some dark issue from my past, in 1999, you drove a car while drunk. I didn't, by the way. But anyway,
we interviewed all your friends and family, and
we really did our homework.
Yeah.
on you.
The
Turns
question
out
is,
that mushroom revival is like a deep dive investigative exposure.
We're forensic mycologists.
Right.
if mushrooms had the microphone and could say one thing to the whole human race,
Mhm.
what would they say?
What would they say? I don't know if I could be, I feel presumptuous speaking for mushrooms. I feel like maybe what they'd say is we don't need you, because I don't think mushrooms need us. And I don't mean that in a harsh way. I guess I feel like some of my deepest trips have been marked by a sense of gratitude that mushrooms are even willing to like engage with me. I feel like you're dealing with an intelligence far more vast and ancient than the human mind can comprehend. I think when you bring in the human spirit and the human body, maybe you can start to get a little bit of an inkling, but I do feel like there's something so vast and so profound. And I don't even know if I'd confine it to mushrooms, or is mushrooms part of something, or I mean, it's hard to even use words to talk about this stuff. Yeah, I feel like psychedelics. I mean, it's interesting because I said they don't need us, but in fact, mushrooms have co-evolved with us in the sense that they've gotten a great deal of propagation geographically. They're you can get mushrooms anywhere in the world right now if you know the right person, even places where they don't grow, and they've been seeded in places where they wouldn't otherwise grow because people want to have these experiences. So in a sense, humans have helped mushrooms grow and expand. But I could see why your guest likes some warning for this question. This is, I think, yeah, I guess what I would say is, for me, I don't think there is a universal message that mushrooms are trying to deliver. If they are, I certainly wouldn't be presumptuous enough to say that I could discern that message. I think they can be tremendously helpful. But I will say this, I have had trips where I've had the sense of, well, so I think a lot of people, particularly in the psychedelic community, whatever that phrase means right now, it's expanded so much, but a lot of people who appreciate and value psychedelics have the sense that psychedelics are here to help us. And I don't know, maybe this will sound sinister, but I've had some trips where I've been like, well, that's a little bit presumptuous in a way. Like I wouldn't assume that mushrooms necessarily, I think mushrooms have their own agenda. I really do. I think these are their own entities. I'll use the word entity for lack of a better term. That have, like everything else, the assumption with Darwinian evolution is that everything wants to expand its territory, and so maybe that's what mushrooms want. I don't know, but I don't think mushrooms are subsidiary or subservient to humans. I don't think mushrooms are just here to help us. I think mushrooms can be helpful, but I sometimes wonder, I'm like, well, how are we helping them? Because I think there probably is some sort of reciprocal exchange. And maybe it is as simple as mushrooms are getting into a lot of places that they wouldn't get into without humans. But I don't know. They're so fucking smart. I'd assume there's more going on than we realize. And I don't think mushrooms are nefarious. I don't think they want to hurt us, but I also think, yeah, it's a little bit pat and easy to just assume that, oh yeah, this stuff is natural and it's always going to be good and they just want to help us. I don't know what's going on in the universe.
We actually have a whole episode about this and the history of psilocybin, the molecule, of why mushrooms even produce psychedelic compounds are not for humans. They're actually to control insects.
Well, that's one theory that, yeah, there's some studies recently, one study I know of recently, right, that's but then there's also the idea of signaling between plants and fungi species. I don't know a lot about this, but yeah, I don't
either
think
either way, it's not us.
Weren't in the
we were not in the picture. And a lot of times, almost like your story when the cops showed up and the paramedics, and they're like, so the universe summoned all of us here for a reason. We like to get into this this almost narcissistic, like human-centric story that we're God and that we're the center of the story, which kind of, we are, everything's God in my perspective, but yeah, I think fungi do a really good job of popping that narrative, which you have to surrender. And that's part of the death experience of, you're just a speck in the infinite universe. And, and that's healing in and of itself, to realize that we're just a speck in time and space, and nothing really matters as a nihilist perspective. And then on the other flip side, everything matters,
right?
And everything's immense and beautiful, and
yin yang.
Yin yang. It's a beautiful experience.
Yeah.
I just got a notification on my computer that, and this will probably be released way later. This is December 8th when we're recording this, but Elon Musk just said he's moving to Austin, Texas. So more fire under your butt to get over here.
You're right. You're getting, you got Rogan, you got, No, I will be back there at some point. I will be, as we were saying before I think we started recording, I did some shows of the Mushroom Cure in San Antonio, but I did not get to actually perform in Austin. And I have some close friends there. So I suspect, when we are able to travel and move about freely without risk of death or killing other people via COVID, Austin is close to the top of the list for sure for me.
Cool.
And
where can people follow you? Is there a way for people to see it online and pay for a ticket, or?
There is not. And I don't think that's going to change. I mean, I think at some point there will be a special release. I was going to say DVD, but who does DVDs anymore? But that was something that was actually in the works, doing a kind of a bigger shoot for a theatrical run that was going to be released pre-COVID. So I think that will happen. But yeah, right now, you can't see the Mushroom Cure online, but you can see my various musings and rantings on the different social platforms, most of them, Instagram and Twitter. I'm at Adam Strauss, AtomStrauss, and then themushroomcure.com. I'll post when I do start doing live shows again. That's where I'll be listing them. If you go to themushroomcure.com, I do have like a little teaser video there. So you can get a little, I think I call it a small dose of the Mushroom Cure. So there you go.
Great. I'll have all of that in the show notes, and highly recommend checking out Adam's website. It is hilarious. Great. Cool. Thank you so much, Adam. This has been a really great time, and I think a lot of people will find immense value in your stories. So thank you for sharing and spending some time with us.
And thank you to the Mushroom family for tuning in Shroomin'. And whether you're listening just audio or you're watching the video, if you are audio on like Apple Podcasts or Spotify, we do have a video component. So head over to our website where you can see it, mushroomrevival.com, or YouTube. Either way, you can watch the video. And if you go to our website, we have a whole line of functional mushroom products. We have tons of educational blog posts, all of our podcasts. Fun time, a lot of mushroom goodies over there. And just want to thank you. And please reach out if you have any questions or future topics that you want us to dive into, or guests that you want us to bring on our show. Please leave a review, spread the word. It helps us put on more awesome shows. And as always, much love, and may the spores be with you.